Hi, welcome to another video from the Systems Thinking Academy. Today we're going to talk about signals. Signals in a control chart are runs of data that help us to determine where to focus our investigative efforts. Let's go back to the material we used in Control Charts 101, where we plotted the output of a factory and the number of defective widgets that factory produced every day. Here's that data on screen, so there's 20 days worth of data. In and amongst those 20 days, day 12 produced a total of 18 defects. And what you can see on the chart, the number 18 is higher than the upper control limit of 16.1. Now that's a simple example of a signal. And effectively, what it's saying is that with a degree of statistical certainty, there is something remarkable about that piece of data that justifies our attention. The advantage of using a signals-based approach to taking corrective action is that it helps us to avoid being distracted by some of the more traditional approaches to identifying targets for improvement. Now, we covered some of those in Control Charts 101, but it's things like binary data comparisons, comparisons of single data points against an average, or comparisons of a single data point against a target or specification. And it's really important that we avoid these distractions. It was Walter Schuhart who described control charts as being the voice of the process. When a control chart is showing high variation, that means that it has low predictability. And in order to improve a process, we need to increase its predictability. So to increase its predictability, we need to reduce the causes of variation. If we allow ourselves to be distracted by non-scientific methods to determine where to take corrective action, we run the risk of the causes of variation in the process increasing. By increasing the causes of variation, we reduce the performance of the process. Deming described this as tampering, and he used the funnel experiment to illustrate this perfectly. I'll provide a link to an example of that at the end of this video. But in essence, the funnel experiment shows us the effect of taking action on data points that are within the predictable limits of a process, and how doing so has the opposite of the intended effect, and how by introducing new causes of variation into a process, it decreases its predictability and therefore it decreases its performance. Bit of an own goal. In the example control chart we have in front of us at the moment, there's only one signal showing, and that's the single point that's above the upper control limit, that number 18. So if we were to take action on the process or the system that supports the process in response to movements in data other than that one signal, or in other words, any one of the other 19 data points, that would be an example of tampering. Fortunately, we have signals which we can use, and once we master those signals, we can avoid that pitfall and have confidence that the interventions we take into any process will have the intended effect. Of course, those interventions are not guaranteed to improve things, but by monitoring the effect of those interventions using control charts, we can evaluate the effect and modify our approach accordingly. There's at least two different sets of patterns that we can use that are collections of rules that determine whether a signal has been tripped or not. There's the Western electric rules, which comprise 4 rules for 4 signals, and then there's also the Nelson rules. There's 8 of those, but the first 4 of them are actually the same as the Western electric rules. But for this video, we're just going to focus on the 4 Western electric rules. The reason for this is that those 4 rules are normally perfectly sufficient for the purpose of identifying patterns in data, and the approach that I'm going to use in this video to help you translate those rules into practical steps that you take in a control chart. Once you've learned those 4 rules, you can study the additional 4 rules in the Nelson set if you want to, and you'll be able to apply them quite easily. So we'll cover a real example of each of the 4 rules now. And the approach that we take for covering these examples will be the same for all 4 rules. And that approach is to display a control chart that shows some data that satisfies each of the rules and then highlighting the data points that apply to the signal. Now I'm just going to pause things for a moment and metaphorically put some stabilizers on our bicycle. I call them stabilizers because they're going to keep us upright while we're learning this technique, but once we've mastered the technique we can remove the stabilizers. So here's a control chart, and now I'm going to add the stabilizers. And what you'll see is 4 grey dotted lines that are dissecting the space between the average and the upper and the lower control limits. If you're a keen statistician or a Lean Six Sigma qualified practitioner, you'll be familiar with the more technical description of the control limits as being the 3 sigma limits. And what we need to do for identifying our Western electric rules is to be able to spot patterns of data when they emerge at various points between the control limits or between the 3 sigma limits. So by dissecting the chart in this way, what we're doing is creating a visual reference point for the 1 and 2 sigma limits as well as the 3 sigma limits, above or below the average. So for the avoidance of doubt, the 3 sigma limit above the average is the upper control limit, the 3 sigma limit below the average is the lower control limit, and the 1 and 2 sigma limits are denoted by the grey dotted lines which appear either side of the average. Now all of that is just background. What we're going to do for the remainder of this video is just use the terminology of zones A, B and C above or below the average. So we've got zone A, which is the gap between the average and the 1 sigma limit. Zone B is the gap between the 1 sigma limit and the 2 sigma limit. And zone C is the gap between the 2 sigma limit and the 3 sigma limit, otherwise known as the upper and the lower control limits. To spot the signals, all we need to do is to look for runs of data points within these zones. So without further ado, let's look at Rule 1. Rule 1. Any single data point that falls above the upper control limit or below the lower control limit. So we don't even need these zones for this one. This is the signal that we talked about in Control Charts 101. It's the single data point at day 12 where there were 18 defects identified. When you see this signal being tripped, to quote Deming, go study. That is, go and investigate the cause of the signal. Remember, it might just be noise and it might just be plain old variation, or it could be a signal that something significant happened in the process and a cause for investigation. That's rule number 1. 1 down, 3 to go. Rule 2. 2 out of 3 consecutive points falling in or beyond zone C on the same side of the average. So here you can see in this example we've got 2 data points that are consecutive that satisfy rule 2, and they're marked by those 2 red dots and they're on the same side of the average. In this instance the pattern is falling above the average in zone C, but it could be equally valid if we had 2 data points that were in zone C below the average. When you see this signal being tripped, go study. Rule 3. 4 out of 5 consecutive data points falling in or beyond zone B on the same side of the average. So in this example we have 4 consecutive data points, that's points 3, 4, 5 and 6, highlighted in red again, and they're within zone B below the average, but again equally they could be within zone B above the average. So that's rule 3. When you see this signal being tripped, go study. Finally, rule 4. 8 consecutive data points that fall on the same side of the average in zone A or beyond. And in this example, highlighted in red again, we have 8 consecutive data points that are running above the average, but equally they could be running below the average. And the same rule would apply. When you see this signal, go study. What you may have spotted by looking at rules 2, 3 and 4 is that they each have a subsequently lower threshold of sensitivity. So rule 2 looks for a small number of data points in zone C. Rule 3 looks for a slightly larger run of data points in or around zone B. And rule 4 looks for a larger still number of data points, but this time it doesn't even care what zone it's in, as long as those data points all fall on the same side of the average. And having this sort of rule of thumb understanding of what trips these signals is helpful when it comes to removing the stabilizers. So you might be looking at a control chart in a work environment and maybe you don't have the luxury of having those 1 and 2 sigma limits or the zones displayed in your chart that you can use theoretically to test for your signals. If you have an understanding of how these signals are tripped by requiring a larger number of data points the closer to the average you get, you start to gain the ability just to read a control chart visually and intuitively. And then over time, practice and repetition means you shouldn't really need those sigma limits to be displayed on there at all. You've got a pretty good chance of spotting the signals when they occur anyway, just by eyeballing the data. But of course, if you want to be methodical, then by all means use those zones. Before we finish, a quick warning on false positives. Remember that just because a run of data has tripped one of the rules, it doesn't necessarily mean that something has changed. Treat the signals as triggers for investigation. It could be when you investigate that run of data is just a coincidence, and although it looks like a signal, it might actually just be variation. So always just bear that in mind. Treat the signals as a trigger for investigation. Go find out what's caused the run of data, and if it's something noteworthy, take action accordingly. Otherwise, leave it alone. It's just variation, don't tamper. So that's our 4 rules. The Western Electric rules, and remember there's also the Nelson rules. Link coming up any moment now, and there's also a link to Deming's funnel experiment. Thank you for watching. As always, comments, feedback, suggestions, requests for particular subject matters you'd like me to cover, let me know. Please subscribe to my channel by clicking on the icon bottom right. Have a look at my other videos, and I'll see you soon.